bottle, and I thought it was vodka. And I thought, well, they knew I was speaking this afternoon, so, but unfortunately, I guess it's not. Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to read as well, but I wanted to just sort of say, kind of biographically, that in 1989, I had just gotten out of the military and was a reservist and studying philosophy, interestingly enough, and took a course on philosophies of war and peace, as many of you may have done as well, or probably taught. And the first set of readings were on pacifism, and two readings that we were assigned were written by Jan Narveson and Cheney Ryan, so these two gentlemen are to blame, I guess, for my being here. Let me put it that way. Much of what I'm going to say is kind of going to overlap some of what we've heard already. Andrew's talk, in particular, is going to be relevant to some of the things that I say, as well as Cheney's. I'm going to disagree right up front with a couple of things that Cheney said. I don't necessarily think that just war theory accepts pacifism in the way that Cheney characterized it during his talk. I think actually there's quite a bit of tension there amongst most just war theorists and pacifism. And I don't think that pacifism has won the day. I do think a lot of our international institutions play with the notion of a pacifist impulse, but I don't necessarily think that they've accepted it. So really, what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what I consider the pacifist conscience. So my remarks today are framed by my perception that pacifism has gotten a bad rap in the mainstream philosophical literature. Almost everyone who writes about issues of war and peace dismisses pacifism as naively idealistic, and many, including Jan Narveson, go so far as to claim that pacifism as a moral doctrine is contradictory, incoherent, and sometimes it's even called incomprehensible. Others maintain that those who aspire to pacifism are irrational and unreasonable, zealots or true believers who understand nothing about the world in which we live. Still others, like Elizabeth Anscombe, characterize pacifists as wide-eyed idealists who think themselves morally superior to normal people. Ward Churchill's even gone so far as to call pacifism a pathology. Pacifism has been so roundly criticized and belittled that it's become the poster child for philosophical extremism, at least in the context of theories about war and peace. Recently, I was working on a project evaluating the moral complexities of so-called targeted killings. A surprising amount of that voluminous literature starts something like this. Unless one is a pacifist, we must accept that targeted killings are acceptable in at least some instances. Really? This assessment seems incredible on its face. Leave aside for the moment that the fact that there are plenty of other good arguments against these killings offered by within other philosophical traditions, for instance, just war theory. Let's just focus on the implication, as Henry Shue recently put it to me, that only a mindless aversion to violence would lead one to the conclusion that targeted killings are impermissible in every case. And Henry Shue, I have to say, is a very well-meaning and sweet guy. He didn't mean this in a derogatory way, but he this sort of just came off the top of his head as we were having a discussion. Put another way, many feel that pacifism is a simplistic, naive, and impossibly idealistic position, as Daniel seemed to suggest this morning. This seems somewhat strange to me, especially given the fact that several of the most celebrated figures of the 20th century were pacifists. Gandhi, King, Aung San Suu Kyi among them. Perhaps this is part of the problem. The people most closely associated with pacifism are, in their own ways, extremists. All three of these individuals were or are zealots of one sort or another. Since they were zealots and pacifists, many think the two things are necessarily associated. The interesting thing is that the zealotry each was known for was related to an ideal other than pacifism. For Gandhi, it was overthrowing British imperialism. For King, the recognition of civil rights for African Americans in the U.S., and for Suu Kyi, democracy in Burma, or it's now called Myanmar. Yet their legacies in large part are related to the fact that each used nonviolence as a tactic in their respective struggles. Nonviolent action and pacifism are not the same, of course, as devotees of Gene Sharp would be quick to point out, but many people make this move instinctively. In the minds of many, and I suspect this is true of most critics of pacifism, the separate aspects of the worldviews of people like Gandhi, King, and Suu Kyi are conflated, the distinction between having a zeal for a cause, using nonviolent action to advocate for that cause, and maintaining pacifism on a personal level are collapsed together. This is the mistake that U.S. President Barack Obama made in his speech accepting the Nobel Prize in 2009. Of course, the psychology of all this is quite complex, but suffice it to say that I don't think there's a necessary connection between being a zealot and being a pacifist. In fact, this is my main aim here today, to try and show how many of the characteristics that pacifists share are not simplistic, naive, or overly idealistic at all. In fact, the pacifists I know are none of these things. They are generally reasonable people who are extremely aware of the complexities of moral and political issues, very often more aware than many of their critics. Many have ideals, of course, but since when was that something to be ridiculed, especially by a room full of philosophers? If we were meant to take people as they are, as Jan suggested this morning, and not as they should be, or not as we read them to be, then we should take pacifists as they are, and that's what I hope to do. So, from this point forward, I want to try and focus on the elements of what I've called the pacifist character. Notice I did not say caricature. I think that's what we get most of the time, is a caricature. I want to make this shift to the beliefs that most pacifists hold for a couple of reasons. First, too much of the literature does indeed rely on a caricature of the pacifist, one that falls into the conflation I mentioned above, and I think Cheney did a nice job this morning of explaining why some of that may be historically. In almost all the literature critical of pacifism, pacifists are straw men who are one-dimensional and easy to dismiss, even by someone as well-meaning and genuinely thoughtful as Henry Shue. The other reason I want to focus on the things that make a pacifist is that when the elements are properly understood, I think most will see this is a much more mainstream position than it's currently assumed to be. Pacifism is not a marginal position at all. Indeed, in my opinion, pacifism is central to certain conceptions of the good, including liberalism and the bourgeois values that Jan spoke of this morning. Pacifism has been too long confined to the philosophical dustbin, and pacifists have not received the respect and consideration they're due. Hopefully what I have to say will chip away at some of these problems just a little bit. So let me begin with a couple of introductory provisos. First, I'm not going to explicitly wade through the many criticisms that are leveled at pacifism. We've all read them many times and heard them recited in various ways. Even today, we've heard many of them set out quite eloquently by several of our speakers. To the extent that I do mention these criticisms, it will be in counter-distinction to what I see as the merits of pacifism. Second, I'm taking a big tent approach to pacifism. There are, of course, many ways of expressing pacifism. There are religious pacifists, anti-religious pacifists. Philosophically, there are deontological pacifists, utilitarian pacifists, pragmatic pacifists. There are absolutists and relativists. Some pacifists instill their views into every aspect of their lives, while others maintain that pacifism is a political principle which has its greatest currency in the context of international disputes. Again, I think Cheney did a really nice job of laying that out. I tend to be pretty ecumenical about all this. It is the diversity of views that fall under the umbrella of pacifism that make it a vibrant and useful position. I realize it's very fashionable to select one version of an argument and either defend or attack that version. So the version of pacifism that Duane Cady develops and defends is the version that Jan Narveson critiques in his paper. This critique is, in turn, refuted by Cheney Ryan, and so on, and so on, and so on. But I don't really want to do that. What I aim to do here is to sift through the various versions of pacifism and find what I consider to be central themes or common themes. These themes, or as I call them, elements, are what tie the disparate pacifist positions together. These elements are what make pacifism interesting to me. In my view, there are 5 elements that characterize most varieties of pacifism. Perhaps it's better to say that these 5 elements are almost invariably held by those who consider themselves pacifists. Now, a good deal of this is somewhat anecdotal, I admit, but I think if you read through the literature and talk to people who profess to be pacifists, you'll see that these themes run together. So I think it's better to focus on the people who hold the view than to strip them out of the equation and dissect a bare and sanitized version of the doctrine, which is the usual course in philosophical circles. These elements are, 1, an abhorrence of violence, 2, a commitment to the use of nonviolent means of conflict resolution. 3, a belief that militarism and the social apparatus that supports it causes more harm than good. 4, a thorough skepticism about arguments that seek to justify the use of force to resolve conflicts. And 5, a genuine and deep respect for human life. Now, let me just pause here for a minute. Some of what I have in the paper relates to the discussion about Gene Sharp. I'm not going to get into that in any depth because we just had a long discussion of it. And there's also, as you'll note, number 3, the belief that militarism and the social apparatus that supports it is problematic. I think was covered very well by Andrew this morning, so I'm not going to go into any great depth with that because I know we're running late, and I appreciate that you've all been here all day and it's hot, so I'm going to try and put this on the fast track. A couple of things will be immediately clear from the list. First, you'll note that I did not include the principle that killing is wrong, the classic formulation of pacifism. I'll return to that a little bit later on. The second thing you'll no doubt realize is that all of these are interrelated in important ways. While you may be tempted in George Carlin fashion, for those who know the reference that I'm making, George Carlin was an American comedian who famously reduced the 10 Commandments to one. You may be inclined to try and do that with my list, but please refrain from doing that at least until I'm done talking. So in the end, I believe that these characteristics form the heart of a coherent, comprehensible, and reasonable worldview. So let me discuss each of them in a little bit more detail. I'll start with the abhorrence of violence. Pacifists see violence as one of the truly intractable and enduring problems of humanity. Most pacifists would go so far as to say that human violence is evil. In either formulation, pacifists share an aversion to violence that surpasses that of the non-pacifist. Whereas non-pacifists accept violence, often resignedly, and some even celebrate it. Here I'm thinking about the writings of those who talk about the myth of redemptive violence and so on. Pacifists refuse to legitimize violence by accepting it as unavoidable. This aversion or abhorrence is perhaps the central tenet of pacifism. Naturally, this is integrally connected to the common characterization of pacifism as being against killing. I use the more general prescription against violence, however, because I think it better captures the pacifist's commitment. Pacifists are not just against killing. They also maintain the view that the use of violence is tragic. Even where the use of violence is excusable or legally justifiable, the use of violence always entails morally unfortunate and regrettable consequences. Let's look at an example in the domestic sphere. And I know Cheney doesn't like to make these domestic international analogies, but I'm going to do one anyway. Police officers sometimes must use violent means to subdue or apprehend criminal suspects. We all know this. Pacifists know it as well as anybody else. In some instances, it is necessary for the police to use lethal force, either because their life is in danger or to protect others who may be in danger. I would just say, I don't think in this paper I used the term either rights or self-defense. I just came close, but I don't think I do, and I don't want to, because we've heard a lot about that today. The fact that such killings are legally justifiable and even perhaps morally understandable, if not excusable, does not mean they're all right. They're still tragic. Such use of force is tragic not only for the recipient of the violence — I will not use the term victim here in order to sidestep the claim that some people might deserve the treatment they receive — but it's also tragic for the officer or officers involved. Further, the tragedy often extends further out to groups implicated in or affected by the violence. For example, the police force, groups within the community such as racial or ethnic subgroups that are affected by the violence, and finally to the community at large. These tragic results are why police forces search for less violent mechanisms to deal with volatile situations, and why professional and civilian review boards evaluate every single instance of the use of lethal force to determine whether it could have been avoided in that instance and how it can be avoided in other or similar circumstances in the future. The same could be said of the use of violence in war or warlike situations. Soldiers use force, of course. To deny that would be absurd. This is, in fact, why so many people seem to dismiss pacifism out of hand, because they assume that all pacifists believe that soldiers must never kill. This is one of those caricatures, however. Most pacifists understand the need for some form of national defense apparatus, although I'll say a little bit more about that later on. And they even understand that soldiers often use violent means to carry out their missions. They simply believe that violence ought to be avoided if at all possible. Where violence is employed, it is a tragic breakdown in human interaction, a breakdown that should be evaluated and dissected in the same way that review boards investigate the use of force by police. The tragedies of the use of force by militaries are even more far-reaching than those that follow on the use of police force in the domestic sphere. This is evident in the social upheaval that follows military actions and on those involved in such actions. You need only ask anyone who's been in combat to confirm both of these things. Or better yet, ask their psychologists. One might object that soldiers or civilians in whose name they act cannot engage in such review boards because in the heat of battle, things are confused and chaotic. War is different, we're told. This is a bit disingenuous to me. War is different than normal human interaction, to be sure, but it needn't be that different. Normal rules of human behavior which presume that one refrain from violence whenever possible could become the norm. To say that this is impractical is no sort of answer. Police departments have made claims like that in the past. In fact, there was a long history, at least in the United States, of police departments resisting the kind of civilian review that I talked about for exactly this reason. If we evaluate the use of force, lethal or otherwise, by military organizations in the same fashion that we evaluate the use of force by domestic police forces, the amount of violence employed would no doubt diminish, just as it did when review boards began looking into the use of violence by police. If we expected that military forces would and should refrain from using the most extreme methods of violence, maybe modern international disputes would look a little less like a Quentin Tarantino film. To say that the use of lethal force is tragic is, of course, a moral claim. For me, it's as significant as saying killing is wrong. It captures what I take to be the pacifist's primary commitment better than the original or general formulation against killing. Of course pacifists are against killing. Aren't we all? I think someone said that today, that we are all against killing. But to say that the pacifist doesn't understand that sometimes killings happen and that sometimes killings are unavoidable, maybe even legally permissible, treats her as an imbecile. Of course she understands this. Her response is not simply a dogmatic reassertion that killing is wrong. Rather, I should think her response would be one of sadness and regret that whatever situation led to the use of violence escalated to the point where violence was used. This is a moral response to the use of violence. Beyond the sadness and regret that a pacifist would feel in response to the use of violence, I suspect that she would be committed to determining how such incidents can be avoided. All the pacifists I know work very hard in whatever spheres they can to reduce the use of violence. I don't mean to suggest that non-pacifists do not do similar work, but pacifists maintain this as a central tenet of their worldviews. They do not accept violence as being inevitable, as most people do. Pacifists are not resigned to the notion that violence is necessarily part of our lives. Instead, the pacifist inclination, or disposition, as Cheney put it this morning, I like that, is to commit herself to developing and supporting nonviolent means of conflict resolution. That brings me to the second element. The primary concern of the overwhelming majority of pacifists is the development of mechanisms and institutions of nonviolent conflict resolution. This is closely related to the aversion to violence that I just discussed. In the face of such a stance, it only makes sense that pacifists would try to contribute to averting the tragedy of violence by working for peace. Historically, this has led to a high degree of activism by individuals and institutions committed to pacifism. I can't help but think that this sort of activism has led to the marginalization of pacifism. In modern nation states, especially those with strong military-industrial base, activism of this sort is at best looked down upon and is often outright repressed. Nonetheless, pacifists have and still do work for peace by forming nonviolent dispute resolution networks. Again, Cheney raised that in his talk. These institutions teach about peace and nonviolence, lobby for nonviolent resolutions to domestic and international disputes, and raise money to alleviate some of the many root causes of these disputes, causes that I was happy to see Jan Narveson acknowledge in a paper that he sent to us. The fact is that most of the people who are committed to pacifism and nonviolence quietly toil against the prevailing violence in society anonymously. For every Mohandas Gandhi and Aung San Suu Kyi, there are hundreds and perhaps thousands of people who commit their work to pacifism and nonviolent action. Now let me just pause really quickly to say that notwithstanding what some people, including Gene Sharp and people at the Einstein Institute might say, I would consider the nonviolent action movement part of the pacifist, under the sort of big tent of pacifism. Right? I think that trying to work for reducing violence in society is a pacifist impulse. And to the extent that they would buy into or accept these other premises, then I think that they would probably be pacifist as well. But I'm going to skip ahead and jump over that since we just talked about it. So that brings me to element number 3, the belief that militarism causes more harm than good. Most pacifists acknowledge that modern nation states will have some sort of military apparatus, although they usually aren't very happy about it. Pacifists tend to view the existence of the military literally as a double-edged sword. This is especially true of places where the military is used domestically and not just externally. I think a point that you had brought up this morning. There are several reasons for this ambivalence. Most obvious, of course, is the historical dichotomy between pacifism and militarism. Modern pacifism has almost always been aligned against a specific military organization, or more generally, against a particular martial conflict. The opposition to one or both of these has been the raison d'etre of most pacifists. This is literally where most of us have formed and refined our pacifist belief. I do not mean to suggest that pacifists are necessarily anti-military, although many are. It's much more complicated than that. As I said above, every pacifist I know personally is realistic enough to know that the world can be a dangerous place, and as a result we need, regretfully to be sure, institutions like the police and the military. But these institutions can be dangerous things. They take on a social role that can destabilize as well as stabilize, threaten as well as protect. As a result, police and military institutions, as well as the economic industrial complex that supports them, pose grave risks. This is, I think, what Andrew was talking about this morning. This point isn't just actually a pacifist position. Former U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower warned against the dangers of the military-industrial complex at the end of his presidential administration. According to Eisenhower and to most pacifists, the economic interests of the private sector in supplying and servicing a large military, coupled with the power that is invested in a large and standing army, can undermine civilian control and make conflicts utilizing the military power more and not less likely. There are some who disagree with this, of course. The traditional argument, and not just among ardent militarists, is that a strong military promotes peace. We heard a little of that this morning. Pacifists reject this, however, pointing to a sizable body of evidence to suggest that the more money a nation spends on military appropriation, the more likely it is to use its military might. This certainly seems to be the case with the United States. Over the last 45 years or so, we've continually been entangled in a string of military endeavors meant to flex our might around the globe. Since the Second World War, the U.S. military and the U.S. economy have been closely intertwined. These entanglements seem to have some tangible effect on military policy and deployments. Most recently, this can be seen in the close relationship between the U.S. military and companies like Halliburton and Blackwater. All this seems to give some support for the argument of pacifists that military might usually means military fight. Because of this, pacifists participate in protests against military interventions, and some even engage in tax boycotts, refusing to pay taxes that would support military expenditures. This does not mean that pacifists are necessarily anti-military, however. As I said, being cautious of an institution and monitoring its activities by way of civilian oversight can be a good thing. Such a position requires vigilance, however. Pacifists are the proverbial canary in the coal mine, as far as I'm concerned. They are the first, or often the first, to point out military excess and the folly of foreign intervention. This often opens the pacifists up to a great deal of criticism and ridicule, particularly in nations like the U.S., where the majority of the population have become more and more infatuated with military history and institutions. Yet even in the face of this, pacifists generally remain the conscience of the nation when it comes to matters of using military might. So this brings me to element number 4, skepticism of arguments justifying the use of force. How am I doing on time? Doing all right?
very well.
Okay. In most democratic nations, the general population tends to accept the arguments that are offered in support of military action. Often this acceptance is completely uncritical, as in the case of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The prevailing attitude seems to be that if the powers that be think it's important to use military force, then the patriotic thing to do is to support the government and the military. Based on this attitude, many governments do not even bother to make a real effort to explain their rationale for the use of force, or when they do it sort of tongue-in-cheek, as George Bush did. They make superficial arguments that play to the prevailing popular will. Unfortunately, such arguments tend to be enough. Pacifists approach these arguments from a more critical stance, though. This is no doubt based in part on the skepticism that most pacifists have towards the military in general, but there's more to it than that. Given their presumption against the use of violence to settle disputes, the threshold in argument for the use of force must meet in order to persuade a pacifist is extremely high, some might say impossibly high. Critics will likely say this is a sign of the intransigence of pacifists. I rather think of it as being an expression of the critical conscience of the nation. Every group of policymakers need to have their positions challenged and critiqued. Such criticism forces a more genuine and thorough debate about the policy being proposed. Policymakers might prefer blind obedience, that's surely the case in the United States, but the decision to use military might is such a weighty decision that opposing views must be aired. This is all the more important when the popular consensus is so uncritical and bellicose. Not so fast, says the just war theorist. We serve that role as well. This is, in fact, true. Just war theorists do evaluate the arguments for going to war with a much more discerning eye than does the general public. They have coherent criteria and, in general, do a very good job of exposing the weaknesses in many of the arguments that are offered in support of using force. Interestingly enough, however, many just war theorists conclude that the use of force is justified in the vast majority of cases. This means that while they are more systematic in their analyses of the arguments that governments put forth for using force, the threshold that most just war theorists ultimately adopt is fairly low. This is clearly not the case of everybody, but there's a lot of them. It turns out that most of the just war scholarship that is produced supports the use of force in a post hoc fashion. Most of the scholarship doesn't critique the use of violence in disputes. It simply suggests, and I think Nick mentioned this earlier, arguments to limit or contain it. This is, of course, an overgeneralization. I can see how I'm sort of jumping at her notepad there. Thanks. But not as much of an overgeneralization as you might think. Thanks. I see it. On a surprisingly wide array of military actions, the community of just war theorists seems to concur with the prevailing view that the use of force is justified. They generally make the more permissive arguments. They make more permissive arguments for why the action was justified, but the effect is the same. Just war theory might heighten the quality of the debate, but it rarely offers critiques of contemporary military deployments, especially where Western nations like the U.S. and Britain are involved. Not since Vietnam have just war theorists systematically, as a group, offered serious opposition to military action, and even then there were a fair number of people who strained themselves to justify American involvement and tactics in Southeast Asia. So this leaves pacifists, in my view, as the last bastion against widespread acceptance. But that acceptance is uncritical, as it is usually with the general population, or the more sophisticated version we get from just war theorists. Pacifists scrutinize the arguments for the use of force, starting from the position that the use of force is almost never justified. Their voices are an important check against unfettered military action. These voices may be marginalized, and the people making these criticisms may be ridiculed and sometimes even attacked or prosecuted by the state, but they're here. History bears witness to the importance of these voices. Pacifists may be crying in the wilderness, but these cries play an important role in assessing public policies involving the use of force. Now, I have a little section here on respect for human life that I'm going to skip over. If you're interested, stand by and I can get you a copy of the paper. But I'm going to try and conclude because I see I'm running out of time. Okay, I can hear some of you already protesting that I've watered down pacifism, that I've stripped it of its essential elements and turned it into something else. The pacifists in the room may be even the quickest to make this claim. Some have argued that the sort of pacifism I've described here is just a thinly veiled version of just war theory. I don't believe this is the case, of course, but I can see how one might make that sort of protest. I've attempted in this talk to extract what I consider to be the salient features of the various forms of pacifism and illustrate how they are more mainstream than is normally thought. In my view, pacifism is not a radical position. This opinion shouldn't bother most of you too much. Remember, the primary criticism of pacifism is that as a doctrine, it's too extreme and unworkable. I've tried to show that in its central tenets, this criticism is not true at all. Surely you wouldn't claim that a doctrine which you hold to be so extreme and unrealistic shouldn't be reworked to make it more reasonable and efficacious. At least I hope you wouldn't. As I've said, I believe that pacifism is not an extreme and marginal position that many make it out to be. At least it doesn't need to be. The essential elements of pacifism are not as controversial as many of its critics tend to formulate them as. In fact, many who would not call themselves pacifists would likely find some ground for agreement with these elements. At least I hope so. Does that make them pacifists? Maybe. But the point of all this is not to convert people, but to show that the views they already hold are compatible with pacifism. Many people, philosophers even, profess to believe in some or all of what I've called the elements of pacifism. So why would we consider, or continue to consider, pacifists such an extreme and unreasonable group of people? It's my hope in the future we won't. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the question.